So about 20 years ago, I read a book called Stumbling Toward Enlightenment by Geri Larkin. At the time, I remember thinking that it was really interesting. The ideas made sense intellectually. But to be perfectly honest, I didn't really understand it at the time. Not deeply, anyway. It felt like the author was describing something I hadn't yet experienced. And then life just happened. Loss happened, growth happened, and suddenly, 20-some years later, I realized something surprising. The book didn't actually change, but I did.
Check one, check.
There's something interesting that happens when you revisit a book years later, not months later, like 2 decades, because the book didn't change, but you did. When I read the book called Stumbling Toward Enlightenment by Geri Larkin, I remember thinking it was interesting, it made sense in some places, but to be honest, a lot of it felt like it was written for somebody else, somebody further along the path than maybe I was. While I did understand the words, I didn't fully understand the experience behind those words. And that's something I think a lot of people can relate to. Sometimes wisdom arrives in our life before we're actually ready to absorb it. The message lands, but it doesn't fully sink in. It kind of sits there quietly in the background, waiting for to catch up. And then years later, something crazy happens. You go through challenges, you go through loss, life events, tragedies, and maybe illness. You go through stuff that completely reshapes how you see the world and how you see yourself. And suddenly, the ideas that once felt abstract begin to feel very real. And that's exactly what happened when I reflected on that book. The whole premise of Stumbling Toward Enlightenment is actually very simple. Enlightenment doesn't happen in some perfect, graceful way. It happens through mistakes, through confusion, through some frustration, and through moments where we feel like we were completely lost and alone. The author talks about something that I think is incredibly honest about the human experience. We don't grow because we have everything all figured out. We grow because life keeps putting us into situations where we have to face ourselves. And most of the time, that process gets a little messy. It's not elegant, it's not glamorous. It's stumbling, it's trying, it's failing, and then getting up and trying again. But what's kind of interesting is that over the last few years, something else has started happening. Science has begun exploring something that sounds surprisingly similar to these spiritual ideas. And that's the concept of the placebo effect. Now, most people have heard the word placebo before. It's something that has no active ingredient. It's basically, I guess, a sugar pill. But the fascinating part is that sometimes people who take that pill actually get physically better. Their symptoms improve and their pain reduces, and their body actually begins to heal. Not because of the actual pill itself, but because of the belief that the pill will help them. In other words, the mind begins to influence their body. We all know you can physically make yourself mentally sick, and you can mentally make yourself physically sick. So think about that. If that is actually true, then you can mentally make yourself physically well, and you can physically make yourself mentally well. And this idea has been explored deeply in books like You Are the Placebo by Joe Dispenza. The concept behind is quite powerful. If the brain believes something strong enough, the body may begin by responding as if that belief is actually real, which means expectation can actually influence your chemistry. Belief can influence your biology, and mindset can influence your physical health. Now, when you take a step back and think about that for a minute, it's actually pretty remarkable. Because for centuries, spiritual traditions have talked about awareness, they've talked about intention, and they've talked about how the mind and body are so deeply connected. And now science is actually starting to explore that same relationship through extensive research. So here's kind of where the two ideas, stumbling towards enlightenment and the placebo effect, start to connect. Awareness actually changes how we think, how we feel, and how we respond to the world around us. And those emotional states directly influence the chemistry inside of our bodies. So when we live in constant stress, fear, trauma, and tension, our body produces stress chemistry. Our cortisol rises, our adrenaline rises. We take a much deeper dive into body chemistry and how your thoughts influence chemistry and what the chemistry actually is in our 8-part chemistry series. Our nervous system stays on high alert, but when we begin developing awareness, we start observing our thoughts instead of reacting to them. And when we start questioning old patterns and beliefs, something else begins to happen. Our nervous system starts to calm. Our breathing slows, our muscles relax, and our body shifts from survival mode into a more regulated state. And that shift alone can actually change how our body functions. Our healing processes improve, inflammation can reduce, our sleep can improve, energy levels can change. So in other words, awareness itself becomes a powerful influence on our biology. But the part that I find the most interesting is most of us don't arrive at that awareness through a perfect spiritual journey. We arrive there through life experiences, through heartbreak, through confusion, through moments where we realize the way we were living our lives simply isn't working anymore. And that's, I guess, the stumbling part. We don't suddenly wake up enlightened. We slowly begin questioning things. We start noticing patterns. We start becoming aware of how our thoughts shape our emotions and how those emotions shape our body. And over time, that awareness creates small shifts. And those small shifts begin changing our experiences of life. So maybe enlightenment isn't something mystical state reserved for only a few people sitting on mountaintops. Maybe it's something much more practical. Maybe it's simply becoming aware enough to notice what we're actually doing to ourselves. Aware enough to question our own reactions. Aware enough to choose different responses. And when that happens, our body often responds to that as well, because our biology is constantly responding to our internal environment, our thoughts, our emotions, our beliefs, which means awareness isn't just philosophical, it's actually biological as well. And maybe that's why books like Stumbling Towards Enlightenment and The Placebo Effect resonate so deeply once we've lived a little more of our lives. As you know, there were many positive takeaways from the Joe Dispenza retreat that we just attended, and this just happens to be one more of them. Because we begin realizing something super important. Growth doesn't happen just in a straight line. It happens in circles. We revisit ideas. We revisit lessons. And each time we come back to them, we understand them from a different level of life experience. And sometimes the things that once felt confusing suddenly become more obvious. And not because we've studied harder, but because we've lived more of our life. So maybe stumbling isn't actually a failure. Maybe it's actually the path. Maybe every mistake and every moment of confusion, every challenge we face is slowly guiding us towards greater awareness. And if awareness really doesn't influence our biology, if our thoughts and beliefs really do affect how the body functions, then becoming more aware of ourselves might be one of the most powerful things we can do for our health, our relationships, and our entire lives. Not perfectly, not instantly, just one step at a time, one realization at a time, and one stumble at a time. Because sometimes I think stumbling forward is still moving forward. And maybe that's exactly how awareness grows.